This is going to be a little bit of a change of pace. So, and before I get started, I should just say this has been kind of an amazing last couple of weeks for me. I was on a nuclear submarine for a couple hours with the admiral who is responsible for transforming the Navy for the 21st century. I ended that same day on a stage in Viacom in New York, getting a selfie with Martha Stewart. The next week I was at Microsoft speaking to the CIOs of the largest companies in the world. Last week I was on a stage at the Masonic Temple in San Francisco talking to 2,000 people, Silicon Valley types, and now I am here with all of you guys to something I've never been before, an economics teaching gathering. And I'm actually, of all of those places, most excited to be here with you guys. And well, except for the nuclear submarine. That was really pretty cool. But I'll explain why. At all of these places, the question was the same. And it's what I'm going to talk to you about today. And to explain what that question is, and what it has to do with economics, and what it has to do with teaching economics, let me just start with how I came to this. About 18 years after a career in physics and theoretical physics, about 18 years ago I started a biotech company to develop new drugs for treating cancer. Not long after I started that company, my father was diagnosed with a rare type of leukemia. And I figured, now I'm in the field, I'm an insider, I have access to all the latest science and tools and technologies, I can do something about this. But unfortunately, nothing I could do made any difference. He died not long after. And over the years, as my company grew and we went public, everywhere I looked, inside small companies, big companies, trapped in the basements of those organizations, were promising ideas that could have helped my father. Not because any of the people involved are bad people, but because of something strange that happens when people come together into groups, all of which boils down into one mystery. Why do good teams, even with the best intentions and excellent people, kill great ideas? Why do good teams kill great ideas? For example, some of you might remember that for 40 years before it became a technology company, Nokia was a conglomerate, a pretty boring manufacturing conglomerate, famous mostly for its rubber boots and toilet paper. Over the next 20 years, it grew into the leading mobile phone company in the world. It had a far greater market share than Apple has today. 1 out of every 2 smartphones on the planet was a Nokia smartphone. And then in 2004, a small team of engineers at Nokia came up with a crazy idea. They said, why don't we build a new kind of phone? And they made a prototype with a giant screen, a touch screen, put an amazing camera on it, and then it's going to be internet connected, and then we're going to have these things called, wait for it, applications. They're going to live in the cloud. You can download them. People will pay for them. And anybody could write stuff for their phone. Same managers shot down both of those ideas. 3 years later, that group of engineers at Nokia watched from a distance as their ideas came to life on a stage in San Francisco when Steve Jobs unveiled the iPhone. A few years after that, Nokia was irrelevant. And a few years after that, it went from $300 billion in market value, the most valuable company in Europe, to being sold to Microsoft for $13 billion, a loss of $250 billion. Why do good teams kill great ideas? So to answer that question, in a way that's never been talked about before, in roughly 200 years of thinking about this problem, I'm going to need a prop. This is my prop. It's a glass of water. When I swirl my finger around, the molecules just slosh around my finger. That's always true for any liquid. In this case, that's always true, but when I lower the temperature at 32 Fahrenheit, something very strange happens. The behavior completely changes. I can't stick my finger in anymore. The molecules become totally rigid. The water freezes into ice. The behavior of those molecules suddenly changed, even though it's exactly the same molecules. Why? How did they notice suddenly change behavior? There's no CEO molecule inside with a bullhorn saying, it's 33 Fahrenheit, everybody just slosh around. No, wait, it's 31, everybody line up rigidly. Oh, wait, it's 33 again. They just do it. So what I'll show you in the next 20 minutes is how answering that question helped the Allies win the Second World War, helped the U.S. lead the world in science and technology ever since, and will give all of us a new way to think about how economics applies in the real world, a new way to think about and get our students excited about practical application of economics that they can use. So, are you ready? Oh my God, this is a big, high difficulty dive. Are you ready? I got 20 minutes to do all this. All right, now we're cooking. All right, to do all that, I'm going to have to explain to you what happens in that glass of water, which is called the phase transition. I'll explain to you every phase transition in nature in 90 seconds. Every phase transition in nature is a result of a tug of war, two competing forces. In the case of a glass of water, one of those forces is called entropy. It's just a fancy word for means run around and be free. The other of those forces is called binding energy. It's a force that wants to lock every molecule 2.8 angstroms from its neighbor, not 2.7, not 2.9. At high temperature, entropy wins. As you lower the temperature, entropy gets weaker and weaker, binding energy gets stronger and stronger, and boom, at 32 Fahrenheit, the system suddenly snaps. The tug of war switches sides, boom, the water freezes. Every phase transition in nature is like that. For example, some of you may have been driving along a highway, just cruising along, listening to your music or to your podcast or whatever, and suddenly run into a parking lot of stalled cars. And you look around, is there an accident? No. Is there an exit ramp? No. Is there an on-ramp? No. Why? What happened? You just experienced a phase transition. There's two competing forces. One, your desire to cruise at target speed. Two, your desire not to hit the bumper in front of you. When cars are widely spaced, like on the left, and let's say a little squirrel runs across the street way up ahead of you, and the driver way up ahead of you taps on his brakes, what do? Well, nothing. So far away, you just keep cruising. That's called smooth flow. Now, when you pass a critical distance, a critical separation between cars, same squirrel runs across the street, same driver taps on his brakes, you see those brake lights go up, what do? You jam on your brakes. Why? You don't want to bump into the car in front of you. Driver behind you jams on his brakes. Driver behind him jams on his brakes. What happens? That small disruption grows exponentially into a traffic jam. That is called by traffic engineers a phantom jam, and you see that in highways. You see that in actually controlled experiments. Now, what does any of this have to do with teams, companies, people? And certainly when I talk to a business audience, I have to explain this maybe to an economics audience, not so much. What does any of this have to do with teams and people and company? All teams are different, all people are different, all companies are different. Well, that's true. But so are all liquids. Water is different than coffee, is different than methane, is different than orange juice, but they all freeze. All traffic patterns are different, all highways are different. There are Toyotas, there are Teslas, there are trucks, there are grandma drivers, there are high school drivers, but they all jam. And that's what I'll tell you about teams and companies. I'll show you why teams and companies experience a phase transition, and then I'll show you how you tease out what you can do with that insight practically. And that's what I've been talking about with all these people. So, how does it work? First, I'll tell you qualitatively, and then I'll throw in something different specifically for this audience, a few equations. And then I'll tell you a story about how we can apply it, how it was applied in the real world. in a very big and very important way. So, qualitatively, every time you organize people into a group with a mission and a reward system tied to that mission, you have just created two competing forces. Two competing forces. The first is stake and outcome. The second is perks of rank. Stake and outcome, perks of rank. For example, 10-person company, stakes and outcome are very high. You start a small biotech company, as I did, 10 people. If that drug works, cancer drug works, everyone's a hero and a millionaire. If it fails, everybody is unemployed, looking for a new job. Stake and outcomes are huge. Now, when you're 10 people, yeah, some people have to be team members. One person's going to be team captain. What's the perks of rank? Well, maybe you make a few $1,000s difference. That's nothing compared to that incredible stake and outcome, right? Now, let's just imagine a hypothetical company, 100,000 people. I'm going to make up a name on the spot. Let's see, Pfizer. 100,000 people, same use, same company. Now, same project comes in, early stage cancer drugs, and every early stage project has some things that look promising, some things that look encouraging. You were excited about it, but it also has flaws. You haven't done this experiment, you haven't done this thing. So now you're same you, same person, exactly the same, sitting at a committee meeting discussing it. Now what are you going to do? Are you going to, if you pound the table about the thing that you're really excited about, its potential, its great promise, well, you can spend 5 years, 10 years of your life up this long slog. And what's your stake in that outcome? Well, a good cancer drug sells a few $100 million a year. Anybody knows what Pfizer's annual revenues are? It's a room full of economists. $50 billion. Your stake in outcome is almost negligible. Perks of rank, though, if you suddenly say, well, I don't believe they've done, it's the same you, and you were excited about it in this other environment, you suddenly say, well, I don't think they've done this experiment, and this thing had a little bit of a flaw, and by the way, I was at this conference where I heard this Nobel laureate give this keynote, and I think, I think the industry is really headed there, and they're really targeting this approach, and I think the industry is not going there, and your boss happens to be in the room. And by total coincidence, that's exactly what she thinks about where the industry is headed, and she's nodding her head. Wow, this young fellow has a head on him. And her boss is in the room. Total coincidence, that's just what she thinks. And she's not, that young fellow has a head on his shoulder. What might happen? Well, you might get promoted. That might happen as soon as next year. And then what happens? 30% bump in pay. More power, more prestige. But just on the micro, just on the economics, just on the finance side, 30% versus 0.5%. What happened between these two? Boom. The system suddenly flips at a critical size, and you can solve for that size. So, all of this, certainly when I talk to business audiences, maybe you read some of these magazines, they're mostly worthless, all this stuff about culture. As a physicist, when I first started a company and first wanted to learn how to be a better manager, I read all this stuff. It was all culture. After a while, I would hear culture, and I would just think yogurt. All this squishy stuff. I just wanted some harder science, something I could really sink my teeth into, and that's what I'll show you. All of this stuff is very different than what you read about culture. And you can think about culture as the patterns of behavior that you see. You have a political culture. You have an innovative culture. You can think about structure, certain economic aspects of how you design your organization, as those small changes that can transform the patterns of behavior using incentives. For example, if you reward rank, you're going to get a very political culture. Everyone is going to elbow their neighbor to shoot down their neighbor's ideas so they can climb ahead. If you celebrate ideas and intelligent risk-taking and results, especially in a group way, you're going to get a very innovative culture. And you can think of that by analogy with the glass of water. Pattern of behavior, the molecules slosh around. Pattern of behavior, the molecules line up rigidly. Boom, underneath that is the temperature. Now where this gets really important, really interesting is there's so much out there about culture, culture, culture. And anyone who's ever managed a team, managed a company, been in the business world, many of your students will end up there, has understood that no amount of singing, telling your employees or your team members to sing Kumbaya and hold hands is going to make much difference. Just like yelling at a block of ice, hey, molecules, can you just loosen up a little bit? Is not going to make much difference. It's not going to melt that block of ice. But a small change in temperature can get the job done. A small change in temperature can melt steel. So, how do we think about that? Where it becomes incredibly interesting is once we can get into the details. So, for example, once you understand that transition, you can begin to manage it. You can begin to get practical applications. Begin to get, as my editor at Macmillan likes to say, news you can use. Forced me to put news you could use everywhere in the book. For example, when it snows overnight, what do you sprinkle on your sidewalk? Wow, that's great response rate. I gave this talk in Southern California recently. Total crickets. I was like, is this mic on in the back? Could you? And I'm like, oh, I was going to say a different word. Damn. Not a good example to use in Southern California. Why do you sprinkle salt on your sidewalk overnight? Because it lowers the binding energy between molecules. It makes them less sticky, less inclined to line up and be rigid. It lowers the freezing temperature. So when you wake up in the morning and you step on your sidewalk, you wet your shoe in a puddle rather than slip on a block of ice and end up in the hospital. Raw iron, when you draw it out of the ground, is a very weak metal. Sprinkle a little carbon in it, what do you get? Solid steel. Add a little cobalt and nickel, and you get the ultra-strong steel alloys you use inside nuclear reactors and jet engines. That's what understanding a transition, in the case of metals, it's a fracture transition. That's what understanding a transition helps you see. What are those small parameters you can adjust to transform behavior? That's what we're going to do for teams and companies. So to do that, this I don't usually show when I don't get this micro when I talk to more general audiences. That's why I'm actually so excited to be with you guys, because I hope you guys will appreciate this. Economics, mathematics, science is nothing unless you can quantify it, unless you can make a model. So you want to start with a model. So we create a model organization, and now we look, there's managers and there's layers, and we look across this organization. I want you to imagine, let's say your job is to design coffee machines. You're many layers down from the CEO. You've worked 7 hours out of your 8-hour day, and you need to decide how are you going to spend that last hour of your day. Are you going to spend it on polishing up your coffee machine design? Or are you going to spend it lobbying your boss, going up to your boss or your boss's friends or your boss's boss and saying, hey, I think I'm just getting this great feedback and great traction for my project. And by the way, I didn't want to say anything, but my neighbor down the hall, Fred, Fred, right, he seems to be a little struggling. Don't say I said anything, but this other customer, I heard that Fred was pretty unpleasant. Also, I think his marriage might be suffering, but just really don't say it. In other words, do you spend that hour on project work or politics? The higher the stake, your equity, the more you may be inclined to spend it on project work. The higher the perks of rank, the more you may be inclined to spend it on politics. What does this sound like to all you guys? Okay. I was hoping for a more economic answer from this audience the first time. A marginal rate of return. So, without going into all the gory details, the basic plain English version of this is in Chapter 7. I think, oh yeah, you'll see that next. The basic plain English version is in Chapter 7 without a lot of fancy equations, if this is something you're interested in for your classrooms. And for those of you who want to understand the model in a little bit more detail, the equation is here. And there you see there's things like return on politics, which is a marginal rate on return. a return on skill. When you write down the model and you write down what are you trying to maximize, what are the incentives, there's cash, there's equity. And the reason this is sort of something I could do, I managed a company for 13 years. I had a head of HR. We'd meet every week. We'd meet every quarter. You kind of know what works in the real world. And this is the kind of model that is in physics we call this a reasonable toy model, a reasonable approximation to get at the heart of what's going on inside a team or a company. And it tells you, there are these two forces. There's the stake, and then there's the perks of rank. You can think of that as equity and cash in the sense of base salary cash. And then you can see when does that marginal rate of return between project work and politics flip. And you can solve that equation, and that's how you solve that equation. And when you solve that equation, this is what you get. And these are the equivalent, these control parameters are the equivalent of sprinkling salt or adding a little bit of carbon. These are the things that you can adjust that tilt the balance more or less to one side or the other. In other words, these are the things you can use to design more innovative teams and companies. And I'll give you, maybe just very quickly, I'm not going to have time to go into it, but as I said, it's explained all in that book that I guess Macmillan gave everybody for free. Is that right? It's nice of Macmillan. I don't get anything out of that, but hopefully you guys do. So M is the size at which the company, the team or company will flip. You'll go from a loonshot phase to a franchise phase. G is the compensation step-up rate. And so let me just explain before I get into those, let me just explain what I mean by these two phases. In water, we have a liquid and we have a solid, totally different behaviors. In traffic flow, we have smooth flow and jam flow, two totally different behaviors. In teams and companies, you can think of this as a loonshot phase and a franchise phase. So let me explain what I mean. By loonshot, what is a loonshot? If you look, everybody knows what a moonshot is, a big goal, an exciting destination. But if you look at the course of science, business, or history, the ideas that really change an industry, change science, change world history, rarely arrive with blaring trumpets and red carpets dazzling everybody with their brilliance. They're usually dismissed for years or decades, their champions written off as crazy. And since there wasn't a good word in the English language for that, I made one up, loonshots. Loonshots, as I said, fail all the time. They fail over and over. Facebook was mentioned. I can tell some of the, and Friendster, I can tell some of those stories later tonight over dinner if there's time, interest. Loonshots fail all the time. In the loonshot phase, employees, teams unite around rescuing those loonshots, saving them from all of their stumbles. Their incentives are aligned around the equity in that project. In the franchise phase, teams and companies may be good at on time, on budget, on spec. At the 27th, things that you understand and have precedent and can sell up the chain in committee meetings. The 27th James Bond movie, the 59th iPhone. And when you're in that franchise phase and somebody comes up to you with a new idea, let's say, oh, here's my idea. Really big turtles who carry swords, wear blindfolds or bandanas, and they love pizza. Okay, get out of my office. That's absurd. That, of course, became Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, a multi-billion-dollar franchise. So, the loonshot phase and the franchise phase. That's what I just told you. Now, I'm going to pause here. Again, what does this have to do with you guys? Why am I here? Why did Macmillan invite me here? Underneath, the book is told, and this actually was fascinating for me to sit and listen to many of you who really have a higher purpose, which is how do we educate, and I'm actually going to come to that with the story I'm going to tell you about in a minute. How do we educate the next generation of leaders, the next generation of people who are going to make a difference for our nation? And it is very important that we get them up to speed on science, on technology, on the economics of how the world works. And all of you, I've heard all day long, how do we make this more accessible? How do we grab our students? How do we convince them? How do we make this fresh for them? How do we convince them that this matters? And one of the things that I found, first in teaching physics, but then in running a company, people don't connect to ideas. People connect to people, and especially stories of people who have changed. And so that's how I tell this book. Underlying the stories of James Bond and Steve Jobs and Isaac Newton and the rise and fall of Pan Am and the Qing dynasty and the birth of the British Empire, underlying those stories and the business and a little bit of physics thrown in for fun, and underlying the business lessons or the news you can use, is a new way to apply the study of incentives. So this is what I hope you guys will take from this. This is how to fire up our students. This is how to convince them. I heard somebody say, I even wrote down this quote earlier today that, whoops, I didn't destroy that. Something like, one of my students said, if you study economics, it can't be good, so I'm going to do something else. Imagine how much good we could do for the world, and this has become my mission. Imagine how much good we can do for the world if we learn how to liberate all those promising ideas that are trapped in basements everywhere. That's how I got started on this. That's the work that I did with President Obama's Council of Science Advisors. How do we nurture these ideas, these promising ideas? How do we liberate them and prevent this group dynamics that kills those ideas? And underlying the answer to that is economics, micro. A new way to think about how micro helps us understand macro behaviors. By the way, just to show you how this is sort of taken off, one of the sort of pieces of news you can use is why teams and companies should have chief incentive officers. And what I talk about is teams and companies spend so much money on hiring a chief technology officer whose job it is to make sure everybody has the latest gadget. Now, if you were running a business and I gave you a choice, which would you rather have? A workforce that had the best state-of-the-art gadgets in your industry, or a workforce that was the most motivated, incentivized, aligned with your objectives in the industry? I can tell you, for me, screw the gadgets. I want the most motivated workforce I can get. And that's the answer of every single CEO, manager, business person I've ever talked to. We all know that. So why do we have a chief technology officer? One of the lessons here is that incentives are very tricky. I'm just giving you a very simple financial example, but there are non-financial things. There's all the works in behavioral economics about the subtle psychology of nudges and so forth. Those are very tricky. When I talk to very famous institutions who are, one investment bank who said, we're going to be a technology company, and they have, A-plus investment managers, A-plus traders, A-plus bankers, top of the league table. And then they said, well, we're going to hire these awesome engineers. Okay, we can't compete with Google and Facebook, so we're going to pay them $1 million a year salary. I'm not making that up. And they come to and they're like, well, we're stuck. Like these guys aren't taking these people's ideas. And I said, well, that's because you have 21st century and A-plus on this side, and you have 21st century and A-plus on that side, and your incentives are 19th century. Your incentives are exactly wrong for these guys to put down the phone and stop making sales calls and actually listen to this crazy new idea which will never work the first time, and the whole time they're listening to this weird engineer talk gobbledygook about some weird thing you don't understand, can't wait for him to get out of your room and stop talking. You've just lost money because you haven't made your 15 sales calls for that day, and you have a mortgage and you have a tuition. Now they want you to take 2 days and 3 days, and if you do that and you put it in front of your customer, it never works the first time, and now your customers who are actually paying you and buying stuff from you, they're pissed off. Why did you give me this crappy early-stage product which blew up in my face? Now you may lose sales from them. The incentives are very tricky. It's also very easy to create perverse incentives. So why do we pay a ton of money for a chief technology officer? And it's a strategic role. I'm going to give you a fixed budget. Your job is to maximize the quality of gadgets that everybody has divided by that budget, and not a chief incentive officer. Your job is to maximize the motivation and alignment of our workforce, which, by the way, as a manager, I'm too busy to make it my first priority to understand the tricky details of behavioral economics or to put together, what are the subtle incentive packages that would work, that would get, traders to take this engineer seriously and vice versa. I don't have time to figure that out, and it's tricky. So why do people have 19th century HR practices and 21st century technology officers? It's a strategic role. Everybody gives corporate stock options nowadays. I think it's one of the biggest wasted resources in corporate America. Why? If you're a coffee machine designer and somebody's handed you a stock option, what have they just created? Well, you created a great incentive to twiddle your thumbs, convince your boss you're indispensable, and if the stock price goes up, hooray! And if it doesn't go up, whatever. You spend your time dialing around for other jobs. In case it goes down, you can get another job. That's a better use of your time, because your coffee machine is certainly not going to move the stock price. That's a cost. Stock options, restricted stock, bonuses, those are all cost. Give your chief incentives officer a budget. His job is just like the chief technology officer. Okay. So I hope I've given you a little bit of a flavor, going very fast. One way to think about this, by the way, is all of you, I'm sure, are very familiar with the work that started with Herb Simon in the 50s and 60s about moving from kind of a classical theory of omniscient rational actors to more behavioral theory, and Simon started in the context of firms, actually. And Kahneman, and then Tversky, and then Thaler, and many others extended that to individual choices. And I'm not showing Kahneman's book just because it's a Macmillan book. Okay, I am showing it just because it's a Macmillan book. You can think of this framework as similar but applied to groups. What the behavioral econ stuff, the Kahneman, the Tversky, the Thaler stuff, gives you is a rational way to think about why individuals make seemingly strange choices, why individuals are predictably irrational. And one of the reasons Danny Kahneman was so kind to me and helped me a lot during this process is this is similar in spirit, although translated into the world of group behavior. Why do groups make seemingly strange choices? In other words, why do groups kill great ideas? So that's just a very high-level discussion, and now I want to show you how understanding some of these principles intuitively played out in practice. And I'm going to end with this story. So to tell you this story, I want you to forget everything you thought you knew about World War II. And I want you to imagine we're here, 1939, brink of World War. Had there been prediction markets, the odds would have favored Nazi Germany. Why? Germans had developed these things called U-boats, which looked ready to strangle the Atlantic, and they did. The German planes and the Luftwaffe outclassed anything that the Allies had, and they looked ready to bomb Western Europe into submission, which they did exactly 1 year later in 1940, within a matter of weeks. And in January of 1939, 2 German scientists discovered something called nuclear fission, splitting the atom, which put Hitler within reach of the most dangerous weapon ever created by man. So if you had been a betting person, you would have been absolutely right to place your odds on Nazi Germany winning. That month, a man named Vannevar Bush, who was dean of engineering at MIT, and a genius-level inventor, invented the first analog computer, invented many of the early forerunners of the personal computer technologies that came many years later. He was also a very good entrepreneur. He started a little company now called Raytheon. But he also understood how to work with the military. He was, in fact, a brilliant organizer. He was the one who transformed MIT from an average university to the leading technology university in the country and eventually the world. But he'd also worked with the military in the First World War, actually on hunting submarines when he was a young guy in a base in Groton, Connecticut. Actually, that's where I was on a nuclear submarine, exactly where Vannevar Bush had been. And he understood from all the fleeing Jewish refugees that Nazi science was far ahead of American science and technology. So he quit his job, moved to Washington, talked his way into a meeting with FDR, President Franklin Roosevelt. It was a 10-minute meeting, and it probably changed the course of the war and the future of our country more than any other such 10-minute meeting. And he told FDR, there's a war coming, and we're going to lose. It's going to be a technology-driven war, and the Army and the Navy are too far behind Nazi Germany, and they will never catch up in time. And he handed FDR a single sheet of paper with 4 short bullets in the middle, and he said, I want you to authorize a new group inside the federal government that will report only to me, and I will report only to you, and I will mobilize the nation's scientists for war. I will develop the technologies that the military is unwilling to fund. And he understood intuitively that not only you couldn't change military culture, no amount of yelling by the generals would melt that block of ice, even though individually every general wanted to win just as much as every scientist wanted to win that war and defeat Hitler. But you shouldn't change that military culture. You needed the tight discipline of on time, on budget, on spec, consistently with quality if you wanted to manufacture millions of bullets, thousands of planes, thousands of ships, direct millions of soldiers in battle. But that environment was exactly the opposite of what you needed if you wanted to nurture the crazy new ideas and the new technologies. In one case, you're seeking to minimize risk. To a soldier, the word risk is a terrible thing. Imagine going to a risky battlefield. That's horrific. To the creators, the artists, the designers, risk is a good thing. You want to try 10 things, 9 of which don't work, one of which changes how people see the world. Imagine you're a soldier and your job is to manufacture planes, and you go to your general and you say, okay, here's my strategy. Why don't we fly 10 planes in the sky, see which 9 fall down? Okay, you're fired. He understood you need to separate your artists and your soldiers. So what happened? And there are a couple more rules, don't really have time for them now, but a couple more principles that are teased out that are sort of the practical things you can do every day with your teams and companies. 1943, spring of 1943, what Bush and several of his colleagues and allies had feared came true. The U-boats were the most serious threat to the war. Churchill understood that, Roosevelt understood that, the military leaders on both sides understood that, Hitler and his generals had eventually come to realize that they would win the war. With the U-boats, they would cut off the last remaining nation in Western Europe, which was England, and that would be it. Spring of 1943, losses to U-boats had been growing exponentially, from 500,000 and 19 tons sunk in 1939 to 8 million in 1942. By the way, some of you might have seen this movie, Imitation Game, with Benedict Cumberbatch, where the Breaking the Enigma Code by Alan Turing helped turn the course of the Atlantic. Benedict Cumberbatch, it was a great movie. Cumberbatch is a fantastic actor. I love Keira Knightley. It is based on a lie. Left out of that story and most popular histories is the fact that B. Deinz, the German intelligence in Berlin, had 1,000 people working on breaking British codes, and they had been reading every intercepted naval transcript from 1938 to 1943, a fact that was suppressed for almost 30, probably 40 years until it came out many years later. Evidence that for the few months here and there that they broke the Enigma code, it made no difference. Losses were growing exponentially. Spring of 1943, not widely known, but very, very well known to Churchill and Roosevelt. You can see in the record, England was down to 3 months of oil. What do planes run on? Oil. What do trucks need? Oil. What do ships need? Oil. What do tanks need? Oil. No oil, no war. We were 3 months away from a united Nazi Republic of Western Europe. End of the war. March 14, 1943, the first B-14 Liberator bomber sailed out over the Atlantic with two new technologies from Vannevar Bush and his group of loons. The first was a radiolocation device that allowed, it was a forerunner of GPS, and it allowed, they built antennas around the Atlantic, sent radio signals, and allowed planes to locate quickly convoys in distress that were being attacked by U-boats that were surfacing at night in packs and shooting them down. The second, and by far the most important technology that absolutely turned the course of the war, was something called microwave radar. It allowed for the first time the pilots to see the U-boats, day or night, fog or shine. And in the next 4 weeks, they began shooting down U-boats like shooting down fish in a barrel. Within 4 weeks, they'd sunk 1/3 of the entire U-boat fleet, more than they'd sunk in the entire prior war within a 4-week period. 6 weeks later, Admiral Dönitz, the head of the German Navy, who had championed the U-boat strategy from the beginning, issued a radio blast across the Atlantic. Withdraw. All U-boats return to base. The Battle of the Atlantic has been lost. That next month, shipping losses fell 95%. The lanes were cleared to resupply England, and the lanes were cleared for an Allied invasion of Europe. What did Bush do? He separated his artists and his soldiers. He understood that there are two phases, and he found the one solution to the very big problem of this whole framework, which is that a system can't be in two phases at the same time. A glass of water can't be liquid and solid at the same time. I said that one time, and someone in the back of the audience said, well, what about a Slurpee? Just for the record, a Slurpee is a liquid, a disgusting sugary liquid, in which are suspended particles of ice that are rapidly melting. If you wait 5 minutes, it will be all disgusting sugary liquid. There's one exception to that rule, that a system can't be in two phases at the same time, and that's right at 32 Fahrenheit. If you bring a bathtub to 32 Fahrenheit, you get blocks of ice, pools of liquid, blocks of ice, pools of liquid, but most importantly, you get something called dynamic equilibrium, molecules cycling back and forth, and that's what Bush did. He created the separation, and he led not like this myth of a great leader, as Moses stands on top of a mountain, raises his or her staff, anoints the chosen project, the holy Loonshot, the iPod or whatever, but he led much more like a careful gardener. He managed the touch and the balance between these two groups, because that's the failure point of most innovation. The failure point of innovation is never in the supply of new ideas. Put 10 people in a room with stacks of Post-its for an hour, you get 1,000 ideas. The failure point is in the transfer to the field. When the team of scientists quarantined in the Rad Lab in Boston first came up with microwave radar, they celebrated. They were in the top of the building. They built a dummy U-boat in Boston Harbor. Oh, we can see the U-boat. This is fantastic. We're going to win the war. Da, 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 da. Boom. Give it to the military. Nothing happened. Didn't put it in the planes. Bush enabled that. He figured out ways around that. He got it in the planes. That's one way. But that wasn't enough. 6 months went by. Nothing happened. He told the scientists in the lab, he said, okay, you guys get in the cockpits with those pilots and figure out what's going on. So, wait a minute, sir, you mean in the war zone with bullets? These were academics. In the war zone, like me, I would have had the same reaction. In the war zone with bullets, yes, you're getting in the cockpit, you're figuring out what is going on. And they discovered that when the pilots had bullets flying at them, going 300 miles an hour, they didn't have time to figure out these 12 complicated switches on these new black boxes. They just wanted to get the hell out of there and live. Their technology worked, the user interface was lousy. They went back to the lab, designed these things you see in movie, the oscilloscope with the sweeping white line and the now called the PPI display, dink, dink, dink. That was March 1943. Boom. That's the garden hoe. Lead like a gardener, not like a Moses. Finally, the heart. Love your artists and soldiers equally. There's so much in the business world, if you read these magazines, which you really shouldn't, about that lionize the creative, the innovator. Just having an idea or a concept anyone who's been an entrepreneur, anyone who understands this, any of your students who's going out into the real world, is maybe 2% of it. It gets the ball from your goal line to your 2-yard line. Someone was just saying at my table, there are 6 football teams in New Orleans. Your goal line to your 2-yard. The other 98 yards is those artists, creators working with the soldiers who is responsible for managing things on time, developing it, manufacturing it, get it on time, on budget, on spec. And it is the transfer between those two. If you signal that you love A or B more than the other, you will imbalance the ship. They will once you leave the room with all your kumbaya stuff, they will not work together well. So that's what Vannevar Bush did. 1944, FDR calls him, and I'm wrapping up. 1944, FDR calls him into his office. FDR has won his 4th election. Most people don't know he's suffering from chronic heart disease. He's going to die a few months later. He has that sense. He calls Bush into his office. He says, what's going to happen to science and technology after this war is over? He said, well, it's going to fall flat on its face like it did in between the 2 wars. He said, well, you have invented this incredible system for innovating astonishingly fast. I want you to write a report and show us how we can use this system in times of peace, to elevate the nation, to improve our economy, to help sick people, to educate our young people. So Vannevar Bush did that. He wrote his report, and that's kind of how I got started in this. When I worked with President Obama's Council of Advisors, I was told that our mission is to write the next generation of the Vannevar Bush report. And at the time, I had no idea who Vannevar Bush was or what his report is. This is what it was. Building on Bush's system and his group evolved into the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, which includes the National Cancer Institute, the National Heart Institute, IARPA, DARPA, which gave us the personal computer, much of the early personal computer industry, the computer graphic industry, even the transistor was helped by national research. Almost all of the biotech industry wouldn't have existed if it wasn't for national research. GPS, the internet, the forerunners of the laser, even the chemotherapy cure for childhood leukemias. All of that came out of the national research system that spun out of Vannevar Bush's ideas. So, to wrap this up, I hope I've helped you understand how bridging 2 disciplines, somebody here talked about one of the things you want to do in economics is bring in other fields of science. So I hope you understand how bridging 2 disciplines, understanding a little bit about micro and incentives inside teams and companies, applying a little bit of physics, a way that's pretty easy touch for students, helps us understand how the Allies won the Second World War, how the U.S. led the world in science and technology ever since, and gives all of you, I hope, a new way to motivate, to fire up our students and get them excited about understanding the world around us through the lens of science and economics. Thank you very much.